Good morning, everyone. I'm Liz Fernandez with Professional People Training, and I'd also like to welcome you to today's webinar. We have three speakers today. Susan Solario is the Assistant Vice President, Public Relations for the National Pork Board, working on behalf of more than 60,000 pig farmers around the country. Susan has more than 18 years of experience with leading a variety of communications, issues, and crisis management programs for various trade associations in the food and agricultural industry, including previous work on behalf of the beef industry to respond to bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Larissa Pooley is the Senior Director of Issues and Reputation Management at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, where she oversees issues, crisis, and communication strategy for the national brand, Beef is What's for Dinner. Larissa has extensive experience leading communications and PR in a variety of industries, such as food and hospitality, nonprofit, and professional sports. She is also one of 90 in Colorado and 5,000 worldwide to have earned her accreditation in public relations. Tricia Sheehan is the Vice President of Strategic Communications and Farmer Relations with Dairy Management Incorporated, the National Dairy Checkoff organization. Tricia focuses on issues in crisis management, helping farmers when industry issues arise, and preparing and training them for a crisis. Tricia has more than 20 years of experience managing issues in crisis communications and corporate affairs in the agricultural industry. And also with us today is Lindsay Cole from Aphis Legislative and Public Affairs, and she'll be available at the end of the presentation to answer any questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Perfect. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar this morning, where you'll hear more about how these different groups have worked together to prepare for a possible foot and mouth disease case in the United States. We really appreciate you joining the webinar, and as Liz mentioned, we look forward to any questions that we can answer during the Q&A period, or feel free to put them into the chat as we go along. We hope in particular this webinar will be really helpful for those of you that will be participating in the FAD Safe exercise happening later on this month. So there's several things we want to make sure that we cover with you today. During the webinar today, we hope that you'll walk away with a better understanding of who the different animal agriculture groups are and how we've been collaborating in advance of a foot and mouth disease outbreak in the U.S. We want to make sure that you leave this webinar with the contact information and understanding who each of the individuals are that Liz introduced at the very beginning. So you'll hear from three of the speakers today. And we also want to share some market research with you and some insights about how consumers are thinking about foot and mouth disease, especially in today's environment, given that we're moving into a post-COVID or an ongoing COVID world, as well as give an overview of our FMD communications approach, plans, resources, and then, as I mentioned, certainly want to make sure that we leave time for plenty of questions and feedback from each of you individually on how we can continue to support you. Let's start with the basics just to make sure we ground set everyone as we go into the webinar today. You have never heard of foot and mouth disease. It is a viral animal disease that affects animals with cloven hooves, divided hooves, such as cattle, swine, sheep, goats, and deer. And the disease does not pose a public health risk or is not a threat to humans. However, it does pose a severe economic risk to the agriculture and food industries. FMD is not the same as hand, foot, and mouth disease for those of you that have young kids that may have gotten that common childhood illness. It's a very different virus. But recognizing the significant impact that this could have on farmers, ranchers around the country that bring food to the table, these groups have worked together for more than 15 years to help prepare, particularly on communications efforts, if there were to be an FMD outbreak in the United States. We would work very closely with USDA Aphis. So as Liz mentioned, we do have a member of Aphis Public Affairs on the line as well. That would be a coordinated communications response, making sure that the government and, again, these trade organizations are working very closely together. And we recognize in particular as seasoned communications professionals that making sure that we've got a plan in advance, but also that we know who to contact and who each of the individuals are, and we've got those established relationships, is really core and really important as we plan and prepare for a potential outbreak in the U.S. So today, as was mentioned, you're going to hear from a variety of different experts. Collectively, we have more than 50 years of experience managing a broad range of issues and crises, both for the animal agriculture industry as well as for other brands, other industries, other trade associations. And as I mentioned, one of the things we really hope that you leave today with is whether the issue or crisis situation is foot and mouth disease, whether it is something else, that ultimately you can make sure that you are contacting us with any questions you may have or any other additional resources you may need. So at the very end of this webinar, we'll make sure to circle back on this slide and make sure to provide you with the individual contact information for each of these groups. So let's talk a little bit about some of the coordinated response opportunities and what we've really been focused on for the past 15 years as this group has worked together. In the event of an FMD outbreak here in the U.S., there's a couple of things that the animal agriculture industries have really aligned to. Number one, we want to make sure that we're communicating consistently and accurately. As we mentioned, this disease could impact a variety of different species, so it's important that whether it starts in one of our individual species and then maybe moves into the next species, that ultimately we're saying the same thing, and at the end of the day, really trying to protect that consumer confidence and consumer demand for meat and milk products in the event of an outbreak. We also all have an individual responsibility to make sure that we're communicating with producers, the farmers and ranchers that each of us represent from our commodity programs, as well as working with our supply chain partners. So some of you on the line may be retail or food service or within the packer industry, and making sure that you have individual resources to make sure that you can take effective action. And again, at the end of the day, with the ultimate goal of maintaining consumer confidence and consumer demand in meat and milk. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marissa Pooley, and she will be our next presenter to talk a little bit more about consumer insights.
Thank you, Susan. So as Susan mentioned, we have spent the last 15 years trying to really keep the pulse on what consumers have to say and what they're thinking about safety of their meat and milk, particularly as it relates to foot and mouth disease. But what we also know is we're in a little bit different place than we were a couple years ago, and we knew as a group we had to really dive back in and make sure that everything that we thought we knew about how consumers thought and felt about foot and mouth disease still was true given this crisis we all just went through. So first, each of our commodity groups has ongoing media and consumer monitoring. So we make sure that we have a pulse on what consumers are seeing and saying, and we do that through a variety of tools, each of us within our own entities, by looking at social media. And as technology has improved over the last 15 years, we've gotten more and more advanced at this, but really looking at what are the topics that are bubbling up? What are consumers concerned about? If animal diseases pop up, what do they say about them? We've been fortunate, knock on wood, to not have FMD pop up very much, but what are some of the other things that people say when there's a recall or when there's other similar themes? We also do market research, of course. We have, each of us has great message testing and consumer market research programs that allow us to really better understand and pinpoint what people think and feel about the messages. So with that, we dove in this past year, and we've done FMD message testing quite a lot in the past. But as I mentioned, and as Susan mentioned, we're all in a bit new era now following COVID, following this unprecedented pandemic. So we wanted to make sure that some of the things that we thought were true and had previously been true about how consumers felt still stood strong. So when we did this, we found that only about 50% of consumers are aware of FMD, but there is confusion with hand, foot, and mouth disease. Thank you, Susan, for clearing that up in the beginning, because about half of the population is unaware, and even more have them confused. Just like Susan mentioned, 40% believe that it impacts children because of that hand, foot, and mouth disease confusion. Once given the definition of FMD and that it does not impact humans and is not a public health threat, concern does not shift. People are still concerned about it. And they don't understand how it could possibly mean that meat and milk are safe if there were to be an FMD outbreak. And they're really concerned. They don't believe, even when given the definition, that it does not pose an impact or a human health threat. So knowing that, we tested a variety of messages, and what we learned was that messages that lean into safety and credibility alleviated the most concern. So what that looked like was mentions of the fact that veterinarians, USDA, Aphis, and producers across the country have been working for years in tandem to watch for the signs and ensure that the supply remains safe for humans. And credibility, consumers really liked mentions of the CDC, USDA, Aphis, and the World Health Organization as credible sources of information. And frankly, we wanted to make sure that all of that was still true, since we've really leaned on these entities and they've been up front and center the past couple of years, and it is. They still absolutely have the credibility that they've earned, and they'll really be the bodies that consumers look to for information. As I mentioned, mentions of farmers and ranchers really caring for their animals and caring for humans performed really well. Again, mentioning that FMD does not infect humans and it's not hand, foot, and mouth disease helped alleviate some concerns. Meanwhile, while no messages performed poorly, and that was reassuring to us, messages around vaccination and regionalization did not perform as well. Now, what we know is if there were to be an FMD outbreak, we certainly would be talking about vaccination and regionalization. So we just have this in the back of our minds, knowing that while we know we need to give information about these two topics because they absolutely will be a component of an FMD outbreak, we need to keep in mind that they're important information, but they won't do the job alone in alleviating consumer concerns. So the key takeaway from this is that regardless of the message, approximately 30% of consumers report that they would stop eating and drinking meat and milk if there were to be an outbreak. Now, they mentioned that that's temporary. We did not define temporary. And while this is a little bit of a scary message for all of us, I think what's important here is knowing that this 30% would be our main focus. In that time, we would really need to win them over and use the other 70% of people who would continue buying our products to help inform and convince that other 30%. And what we do know is when consumers mentioned that when they stopped seeing messages at grocery stores and restaurants, they may consider eating and drinking meat and milk again. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Tricia.
Thank you, Marissa. So I'm going to jump in here now and see if I can advance my slide.
Remember,
and I'm going to start talking. I'm going to start us with our FMD Crisis Communications Plan. So one of the key things that we've learned through the work that we've done is the fact that we can't just be sitting and waiting for something to happen. We need to make sure that we're working hard on the prevent, prepare, and then respond side of things. So we've got three arms to our plan here that we're working on. So when we start off on the prevent side of our communications plan, the biggest piece that we want to reinforce is the fact that we know that we're not working alone. We know that we have to do this in coordination with farmers and the government, including USDA, Aphis, FDA, CBP, and other groups. We know that there's a lot of people out there that are working to regulate imports, help with border protection and inspection, traveler education, and then on-farm biosecurity efforts. And we also have our quality assurance programs in our different breeds that are out there as well. There are other communication industry assets out there. We've got an example of one here on the screen with the Don't Pack a Pest, where we've talked to the groups with Customs and Border Protection about this program too. So just trying to keep everybody aware and informed about all of these pieces that are out there. So part of our FMD Crisis Communications Plan, and both Susan and Marissa mentioned it, but is this collaboration across our groups. We know that this is not going to impact, if FMD hits, it would not impact one group alone, and it would hit many of our industry organizations. So we need to make sure that we're collaborating and working across those from the very beginning. So to do this, our group does a lot of joint planning. Marissa just shared with you some of the market research that we've done in the past, along with the message testing that we've done out there. We know that as times change, we need to make sure that we're keeping a pulse on where the public is and where our agriculture groups and farmers are at. So that's an important piece for us. The other part is participating in drills. We know that even though we can never fully simulate what a crisis like this would encounter or what we would all have to deal with, making sure that you're going through those drills and participating in the drills does help keep people's eyes open to some of the possibilities that are out there and helps you see some of the gaps that we may have in our plans and allows us to then refine our tools so that we are better prepared if a crisis does hit. Another piece that we have worked hard on is building relationships with key stakeholders, making sure that different groups know that our group is out there and that we are connected to other industry groups so that when a crisis does hit, we know the right people to reach out to and the right people that we should be working with. We've also talked about how, as our industry group, we want to make sure that we're sending consistent messages. So having coordinated statements and doing this crisis communications planning is an important piece to making sure that that consistency is out there. And then along with that is establishing that communications flow of information. And then, like I said at the very beginning, that utmost importance is ensuring that we are in lockstep coordination with USDA, Aphis, and the other groups that are out there leading the charge here. We do have a number of producer tools that are out there as we're in this prepare phase. We've got the secure supply plans for beef, milk, pork, and sheep and wool, so that these are groups that we want to make sure that we are coordinating with and sharing information with as well. And as I've kind of mentioned a few different times here, partnering for an effective response we know is a key if we are to get it into a crisis and managing through a crisis. So the fact that the beef, pork, dairy, and sheep organizations have been working together on this effort specifically, but then other efforts too, and then in coordination with USDA and Aphis and other government groups, just ensures us that we're going to present our producers kind of that consistent messaging, that consistent information that they will find important, and hopefully will help them manage through a crisis situation. Just wanted to spend a minute here talking about that FMD Communications Flow. So we know that USDA and Aphis would be taking the lead if we got into an FMD situation. And then as they share that information out, we are one of the groups that would be out there to help kind of relay that messaging out to producers and consumers. We know that both of those audiences are going to have questions, but yet very likely different questions about the situation. So we want to make sure that we've got the right resources and recommendations for the farmers that are out there, but then we've also got reassuring messages about the situation, the facts about what's going on, and what they need to know about the situation as well. And we would use a variety of different tools to make sure that we would get this information out to both of these groups. Through our producer groups, we have emails, webinars, the trade media that we would be working with, as well as our social media properties that are directed towards the agriculture groups. But then we'd have different elements that we would use with the consumer group. So we would, again, use our social and digital consumer channels to share information with those audiences as well. Just spending a minute here on our kind of rules of the road, and I know that I've said this a few times, but we would follow the lead of, USDA and Aphis. We would not share any information out about the specific farm, the specific species that FMD was confirmed in, unless USDA has done that first. And even after USDA and Aphis has released any specifics about the farm, we would not go in and reshare those farm details, the name, the location, any specifics about the farm. We would stay at that very high level that FMD has been suspected or is confirmed, and sharing farmers what they need to know without giving too much confidential information out there. We would also make sure that we are not sharing market-sensitive information and wouldn't be speculating on the situation either. Our goal is to share the facts and to help get that information out there and to reassure both farmers and the public about what's being done and the actions that are taken. This slide here just shows a few of the communications channels that our different industry groups would be using. The first one listed there is fmdinfo.org. That is a website that we have had for a while now. We've got some background information there, a short Q&A piece, but if FMD were confirmed or suspected here in the United States, we would go in and add a bunch of information to that page to be able to use that as a hub to share information and details about what's going on and what people need to know. And then across our different industries, we have different social channels that we would use. We have our state and regional councils or Checkoff organizations and affiliates that we would be sharing information to as well as different consumer-focused social media or websites that we would share information on. So our goal would be to use as much of our existing channels and information sources that are out there to get the word out and to be sharing this information. And again, that consistent key message is what we're looking to do and to put out there, because our ultimate goal is to not add to the confusion, but to help folks hear that consistent message and feel reassured that the industry is acting and that they can feel safe and enjoy their meat and milk at the dinner table. The guiding principles for our response, and I know I've said this a few times, but we want to make sure that we reinforce that we're following USDA and Aphis's lead in development and the timeline of communication. We would not get out ahead of the group, but we would want to help share the information and get it out to a broader audience. We want to make sure that we deliver research-based key messages to consumers through our established platforms. So the websites, the news media, Facebook, other options that are out there that are already being used by these audiences. And we want to make sure that we use a variety of channels and medias to make sure that these messages reach the right audiences. We know that we've heard that, in order for a message to be heard or to be understood, it needs to be reinforced 7 different times in 7 different ways. So our hope is that through USDA and Aphis sharing this information, along with our group sharing the same information out, we can hopefully get close to that threshold where people are going to see it and remember it and be able to take note of it. We also want to make sure that we're facilitating productive dialogue with key stakeholders. So ensuring that we know what's going on with the situation, where things are headed, what the next steps are, and making sure that the right people are aware of this as well. And the other key piece of what we would want to make sure that we're doing during a crisis is to monitor the consumer sentiment. So we know that as a crisis takes shape, there's going to be a wave of consumer sentiment and feeling about what's going on. So we want to make sure that we've got a pulse on where that sentiment is and if the messages and information that we're sharing is resonating with this group. If it is, great, then maybe we continue with it, maybe we expand how we're reaching these groups. If it's not quite hitting the mark, we can adjust it and come back with a refined message to get out there. But we want to just make sure that we're keeping a pulse on that and that we're ready to respond and alter things if necessary. This is just a quick snapshot of our communications asset. I mentioned the fmdinfo.org website. There's a screenshot of that on the top. And then we also have some short little kind of infographic materials, if you will, just to reinforce some of those messages that Marissa was talking about earlier. We know that using different mediums to get information out is going to be important. So we've got a few of these pieces that we wanted to just show you what we do have and what could be used and be available if needed. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Marissa to take us through the feedback section.
Thank you, Tricia. So we will have a moment to sort of have an open Q&A session. But before we did that, the group wanted to really collect some specific feedback from this group of people. So our first question to you, and you can just put this into the chat, or you could even email us later on with some of your feedback on this. We would be happy to receive that. But our first question, no matter where you are along the supply chain, whether you're a vet or a packer or a state organization, what else do you think that the industry can be doing to help communicate with consumers and engage producers should there be an FMD outbreak? So we'll just take a minute and see if there's chats entered. Like I mentioned, please feel free to enter some answers in there, or of course email us if you think of something later. Oh, that's a good one, and please, my fellow panelists, Tricia and Susan, feel free to pop in. But I just saw one that said, how many different languages are the infographics and messages in? And currently, they're just in English, but that's a really great idea for us to translate those into some more languages.
Looks like several people like the infographics, Marissa. That's always a good sign, and would need some help with social, sounds like.
Marissa, you can go ahead and read these for everyone if you'd like.
Sure. Yeah, you bet. And please, like I said, Tricia and Susan and anyone, Lindsay, anyone, feel free to jump in. How are markets involved in the communication plan, i.e. Livestock Marketing Association?
Yeah, I can take that one, Marissa. This is Susan. That's a great question. I know have met with the Livestock Marketing Association group in the past to share the overall communications plan and resources. I honestly don't know if we have anyone on the phone from LMA with us today, but I do know that they've definitely been an audience where we've tried to coordinate and let them know what we have available and ask them also for feedback of what resources they may need to be able to coordinate and speak particularly with livestock marketing owners at the sale barns and at some of those places. So that's a great reminder of just some of the other groups that we may not have named in the upfront of who we've collaborated with. It's really been the core animal agriculture industries, but we have met with groups like the Livestock Marketing Association, Animal Agriculture Alliance, again, don't know if there's anyone on the phone from there with us today, and a number of other different coalitions that exist, and a great reminder that we should continue to make sure we've got those strong relationships built and that we can provide tools and resources that would be helpful for them as well. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan. I think, Susan, this next question probably builds off of that, but of course anyone can feel free to add some more. Where does cooperative extension fit in with the communication outreach during a response? And I think the answer is similar to what Susan just gave, but Susan or Tricia, feel free to add.
Yeah, this is Tricia. I was just going to add that I know through our state and regional checkoff groups, they have a lot of those cooperative extension agents as well as leadership from each of the different states that are part of their kind of cascading of information, if you will, since it's at that state level. So definitely a group that we would want to make sure that is involved and included as we're sharing information out.
And I'll also mention at the USDA level, we work with our partners across USDA, and they send publications and information out to cooperative extension so that they have those if they get questions.
And this next comment mentions helping producers accept biosecurity plans and explain that to consumers. And again, I think that builds upon what we were just talking about with cooperative extension and with some of these groups. I know that each of our commodity groups has biosecurity planning programs for our producers, and that's also part of the Safe Beef Supply, the Safe Pork Supply groups, as well as each of our checkoffs.
Marissa, one question I saw on that front that maybe we can address as well is, do state-level associations have state ag connections like Aphis has with the national groups? And I'd invite any of my colleagues and or Lindsay as well from Aphis to weigh in. But again, I think that's a really great point is each of the individual commodity groups, so at least for us in the pork industry, we have state pork associations, dairy and beef have those as well. I'd really encourage you to know who your state animal health contacts are at the state level, whether that's the communications person, the state veterinarian, if you are a veterinarian or more of a subject matter technical expert, develop those relationships in advance because, number one, we all know that people do change positions, especially, following the past year and a half that all of us have lived through. So people change positions and careers frequently, but making sure that you know who those different individuals are that you could coordinate with and reach out to, I think is a really, again, great idea and was really one of the core reasons that this group was founded, so that each of us, again, whether it's FMD or something else, knew who the communications person was at each of our species and or Aphis and could reach out and coordinate with them. So I would say yes, most of your individual state animal health groups probably have a communications lead, correct, Lindsay? And that if you want to reach out and coordinate with them, particularly if you are participating in the FAD Safe exercise later on this month, that's a great relationship that I think is worthwhile to make sure that you're nurturing. Anything you would add there, Lindsay?
No, I think in past outbreaks it's been at varying levels in different states, and there's some states where we've worked really closely with the state level associations, and some where we've worked mostly with our national counterparts. But we rely heavily on all of our state partners to help us make those connections because they're really in place. They're really good relationships there.
This next one I see mentions increased social media presence along with FMDinfo.org and Twitter, Instagram, etc. A couple points I'd like to make about that, and then, of course, open it up, is that FMDinfo.org, Tricia did a great job explaining that right now it's quite basic. It has some Q&A and some brief information. But behind that, there are quite a few dark pages that we would activate in case of an outbreak, and also use some paid Google SEO tools to bump that up to the top of Google so that ideally, just as Tricia mentioned, it's a primary source along with USDA and Aphis websites, of course, for getting the information. And in fact, many of those dark pages link back to USDA, Aphis for primary sources of information. Meanwhile, we are also developing some social media posts that go along our messages and are drafts that are at least ready to go should we need them, and of course could be tweaked as we, hopefully not, but if we were to get into an outbreak situation.
Marissa, there was a lot of questions about misinformation that was coming in there, knowing that misinformation is a big challenge in today's day and age. And I do think, just to kind of, my first stab at the answer is we're obviously going to be monitoring and watching for that. We're not going to be able to stop all that misinformation that's out there, but we do want to monitor and keep track of what's out there and do what we can to kind of recorrect that narrative. So as we're seeing some of that stuff, our plan would be to look at how we can reapproach or redirect folks to the correct information and the right messages. So we know that that's going to be a challenge that's out there, and it's something that, we don't have the exact plan set in place because it's hard to plan for what that fake news will be, but we know it's an issue and a challenge that we would be watching for and be ready to tackle and address as needed.
Yeah, and that's really important. And all I was going to add was at USDA, I think that we're a little bit more limited in what we can do on social media than many groups, and we're working to change that. We have a newly launched Facebook page, and we'll be definitely sharing information on that page in any future animal disease detection event. But, you know, we really like to partner with people to share information. We're happy to share resources and things like that, but we definitely look to our industry and state partners to help us get those messages out on social media.
I see also a comment about the Washington BSE case, and I think that's a really good point that, yes, we actually have based quite a lot of this on sort of that case study and what we learned, as well as the most recent COVID pandemic. The one thing that I think we've all talked about as a group that throws a little bit of a wrench in that BSE case being our case study is, of course, the rise of social media and, of course, the rise of as many options and channels on social media. So while we feel lucky, frankly, this many years post, to have that as a really good example, we know that there are some new challenges since then that would really pose some potential threats facing this in 2021, post-2021. Anything else to my colleagues that you've spotted in the chat that I have missed?
I did see one comment or a couple of comments that talked about using different radio programs or radio groups to get information out, and that would definitely be part of our plan. We've got some great farm broadcasters that all our groups have worked with over the years, and they would definitely be one of those key connection points to reach out and make sure that we're sharing the right information with so that they're able to share it with their listeners as well.
Yeah. And many comments about having materials in multiple languages, which is also a great idea that I think is all on our radar, and no time like the present to start creating some of those materials. Great. Well, I'm going to move us on to our... Oh, yeah, please.
I was just going to say, I did see a couple more where they were talking about biosecurity plans and kind of explaining and sharing that more with producers, but yet also consumers. And part of, you know, while this pandemic that we've been going through has been challenging, I do think consumers have learned a little bit more. They've heard a little bit more about some of these types of things as we talk about, you know, the challenges that we've had with the current pandemic. So again, understanding biosecurity, why it's out there, the reasons that it's out there, it would, again, be a part of what we're wanting to communicate and share with folks. And I do think, like I said, if the pandemic has helped us a little bit, there may be a little bit more understanding and awareness of those types of situations now, too.
Yeah. And Tricia, and the only thing, oh, go ahead, Marissa.
No, you go ahead. Please add.
I was just going to say, just to build on Tricia's comment, I think, you know, one of the best consumer-facing programs right now that hits somewhat on biosecurity, less on farm and more about how we're protecting our borders and our ports of entry is the Don't Pack a Pest program that Tricia mentioned. That's a program that the cross-industry groups have actually collaborated on behind the scenes with Customs and Border Patrol to make sure that as people are coming out of the country, that consumers understand why we're asking them to declare certain products, you know, when they are going through customs, what products can and can't be brought into the country, and frankly, the rationale behind why products can't be brought in, because a lot of people, you know, may not understand that. So I think in the even short-term immediate future, some of the great work that's been done by CBP, one of the projects right now we're working with CBP behind the scenes on is to make sure that we're getting some of that information into the hands, especially of students that are spending time studying abroad, especially as international travel does kind of reopen back up following some of the shutdowns we experienced over the past year, that they, again, realize what they can and can't bring in, and really the risk that it poses and why they're not allowed to bring certain things in. So definitely a great, I think, opportunity just to continue to really expand that program and help those international travelers understand the service that they can provide in really helping protect things and protect our food supply.
I'm going to move us on to the second question, but before I do, I saw a comment come in asking us what our group will be doing in the upcoming FAD-Safe exercise, and thank you for asking that. That will really be our chance to test our collaboration and all these materials and things that we've produced. We've participated as the cross-species team in these before, but we have some new materials, some new learnings over the past year and a half, plus some new members. So we will be there, and we'll be participating and testing some of these things out with all of you. The next question is, in an FMD outbreak, what role would you expect the livestock industry to play? Yeah, I'm seeing some assisting with stop movement messaging, so talking about, that would definitely be our role to talk about what that is and why there would be stop movement orders.
And Marissa, I know that that's one thing that our groups have talked about. You know, we do different drills with our producers in an ongoing effort, some of them specific to FMD, some to, you know, other crisis situations, but helping people understand what a stop movement order really is. Because you can say it and you maybe have an idea of what it is, but I don't know that a lot of people really understand what a stop movement order would mean for their farm, you know, for their town, their county, whatever it might be. So we have done kind of some slow education on that part, if you will, too, is just making sure that people realize what it really does mean.
Yeah, and building on that, Tricia, we even tested, based on new consumer public awareness, would talking about it as temporary quarantine, or some of the phrases that we're now familiar with, would that help to alleviate some confusion? So we're continuing to test what exactly would make the most sense. But again, if there was any benefits from the last year and a half, it's really being able to sort of test some of these things and see now that we all have a different understanding of disease. Great. I'm seeing a lot of stop movements and distribution of information. Anything else before we move on?
I'm seeing some other comments just also up there about continuing to really expand the CDP program. So, you know, looking for opportunities to put additional materials, information on what can and can't be brought in with travelers and airports through posters and some of those things. So that's great feedback as we continue to work with CDP and some of our other partners to make sure that we're more preparing on the front end of things. I think some vaccination is used and messaging about safety of vaccination. Marissa, I think you touched briefly on vaccination and what consumers thought, but do you want to maybe replay that just for the group and expand?
Absolutely. Just like this comment, we were really curious what that might look like again after this case study we've all lived through the past year and a half. And while it didn't perform very well in alleviating concerns, what I can tell you is that no messages that we tested performed poorly, meaning none of them added to concern or made concern worse. And so through that, we then tested different options for messaging vaccination. And what we learned was, while people didn't totally understand it, they still were really interested in learning about how vaccination would be used. And again, citing CDC, USDA, Aphis, World Health Organization, we weren't sure if it would be effective, and it indeed was. Pairing vaccination with these really credible bodies really helped with some of that messaging. depopulation is, of course, someone mentioned when depopulation is used, there will need to be help explaining why it's necessary, and that is, of course, on our radars.
And again, Marissa, not to harp on COVID, but we did have some chances just in the last year where depopulation did happen on some different farms, and we were able to kind of watch the messaging that was put out about that and how it was received and all of that. So.
Mm-hmm. You know, and I think it's important to mention that, and Lindsay, of course, if you have anything to mention too here, but while the U.S. has been fortunate to not have active FMD outbreaks in about a century, other countries have dealt with this and continue to deal with it. And so we also continue to look at them as examples of what to do and what not to do in communication around this issue.
There's another comment here that I think has really emerged over the past year and a half, particularly with COVID and more on the producer side, but how producers can deal with mental health and the stressful situation that many of them will be put in, particularly if it pertains to depopulation and or disposal. So that's a great comment, and I know something we've started talking about really in depth at Fork, just how do we continue to provide more of that producer support, that mental health support. Are there organizations and companies that have a lot of those, tested methodologies, again, based off of COVID, that we can really leverage and put into any of our foreign animal disease preparedness plans? So great comment. I don't think that we have all of the answers yet, but again, I think we can take some really good learnings from COVID, unfortunately, and to figure out how we apply those moving forward to FMD. And yes, I agree. Sorry, I'm just seeing the same person type in. Impacted would be producers, responders, veterinarians, employees. It would really span the gamut. It wouldn't just be the individual, owners necessarily themselves. We recognize that it'd be a very challenging time for anyone that has contact with animals on farms. So definitely an opportunity to look at how we can really broaden some of those tools.
Great. Well,
yes.
Now we'd like to pause. Go ahead, Susan. Did you have something to add, or Tricia?
No, I was just seeing some of the other chats come in about, making sure that we're pooling some of those resources and being a conduit to some of those resources. So I'm sorry, I was just nodding along as I was seeing comments come in.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Well, we'd like to take a moment and open it up to any questions and answers questions you may have, and hopefully we can provide some answers or resources in addition to these really specific questions that we had for you. That's a great one. In a rapidly changing situation, for instance, early in an outbreak, how do you ensure message consistency? And I thank you for bringing that up, because that is the whole purpose of our group. We all recognize that, of course, we will be working for our individual commodity groups, but the power of our collaboration and coordination, particularly as we lead up to a potential outbreak, doing this 15, 20 years in advance, is making sure that we all coordinate and collaborate together in ensuring the types of messages would be consistent with each other and additionally consistent with USDA Aphis, to make sure that when stress is high and things are scary, that we would be consistent and coordinated with each other.
One of the next questions that I saw come in, Marissa, and maybe Lindsay can take this one. Has DHS been involved in conversations, and is FMD on their radar? I know in the early days, certainly of the cross-species group that I was involved in, Lindsay, that DHS was very active in a lot of the planning and drills, but is there anything more that you can add from the government side?
I think from our side, the main thing is we work with them a lot. We talk to them all the time about products and what they should be looking for, and how we can coordinate on things. Lately, our focus has been probably a little bit more on African swine fever, but we still have those relationships and those connections, and we talk to them about things. So yes, that's all in place and ready if something were to happen. Latest question about how the move from FATL to NBAF is factoring into messaging. Just generally, we have a communications team at NBAF, and they actually are with USDA's Agricultural Research Service, because that's a partner agency that is on site there, as well as at FATL. And so we work with them. I talk to that team every day. And we coordinate on messaging, we coordinate on media calls, we coordinate on all of those things. And so those relationships are also in place. So we know that what they're planning, we have taught them, that team, in our Aphis Risk Communications training course, which is a 2-day communications course on communicating in all sorts of high-risk situations. And so I think that we have a really great partnership with that group. And if, depending on what needed to be done in an actual outbreak situation, they would be right in the mix in the Joint Information Center.
Thank you. We're getting some ideas for good resources to point to.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Great. Well, maybe we'll give it one more minute and throw your chats in for any final questions. Great. Well, I'd like to close out with a couple more things and then kick it over to Lindsay. As Susan mentioned, we are really happy to collaborate and coordinate together, and it's really important for us to become a resource to you. So please add us to your contacts. Reach out to us with questions. If we don't know the answer, like someone mentioned in the chat, we may not know all the answers, but we hopefully can be a conduit for you to more resources. And then, of course, follow our different groups on social media, follow our websites for more information, follow fmdinfo.org. Hopefully you'll never need to go there, but in case you do. And then, of course, sign up for some industry alerts from USDA Aphis. Here is our contact information. Please feel free to take a snapshot or let us know how we can be useful to you. Thank you all for taking the time today to chat with us. Susan, Tricia, is there anything else you'd like to add before I kick it over to Lindsay?
I think the last comment that I just saw come in, Marissa, is how do we make sure that we receive the updated messages from the team so that we can kind of reshare them with our stakeholders? And I think there may have been another question about where we're at with the messages. So as Marissa mentioned, with the new updated message testing that the Beef Checkoff and National Cattlemen's Beef Association have actually led up on behalf of the cross-species team, we are in the process of updating our messages on FMD. You all actually got a pretty early sneak peek on very, very recent research that was just conducted. And so we're planning to update those, and we can distribute those and make those available as we participate in the FAD Safe webinar, FAD Safe exercise, later on this month. But know that those are works in progress. And again, a lot of what Marissa shared with the group is just hot off the press. And then if we do have an actual FMD outbreak in the U.S., the way that we would really love to coordinate with others on the call if you participated is, again, make sure that you've got our contact information so that you can reach out to us. You may deal with one more specific species than another. If not, you can always contact just one of us individually, because we do plan to have those messages that are synergistic, even though mine would be more about pork and Marissa's would be more about beef, as a great example. But again, that's just an opportunity for synergy and for us to be able to share some of those pre-approved messages, and then we'll make sure that we can push those out as far as wide as possible with any of the stakeholder groups. Also, at least for the pork industry, one of the other links that I added on here is porkcheckoff.org/emails. That is more of our industry stakeholder email alert system, where we share a variety of different pieces of information, particularly we did that during COVID, and it's more industry focused than it is consumer focused. So please sign up for that, because that would be one of the tools, again, by which we would at least push out information, or again, you can reach out to any one of us. So I hope that helps clarify, and definitely get signed up for those Aphis stakeholder alerts. I can personally say I find them extremely helpful and beneficial. They're not just about FMD, they're about a whole variety of different things, and definitely think it's worth the time for one of the emails that you probably read on a regular basis if you're within the industry.
Great. Well, thank you all. And Lindsay, I'd love to have you sort of close us out and give us more information.
Absolutely. I was really asked to just say a couple of words here at the end about Aphis Communications. I don't have much to say that we haven't already said. So I want to stress that it's so important that we're on the same page with our industry partners, our state partners, and others in terms of communications and messaging. In terms of the initial announcement, I'll just mention that anytime there's a finding of any high consequence for an animal disease like FMD, Aphis really needs to be the first to make that announcement. And that's only because we need to ensure two things. And that's one, that our National Veterinary Services Laboratories has completed that confirmatory testing before there's any announcement made. And second, that we can coordinate timing of any notifications to our trading partners, because they don't like to hear about these things through the media. And so I know that these are really high-stress situations, and there's a lot of times a lot of rumors flying around. We have some holding statements and things like that prepared that we can use until we actually make that confirmation and are ready to make the announcement. We will always communicate with our industry partners and our state partners before that happens, so that any other announcements that you all want to make are ready to go out as soon as we put our initial announcement out, and they can just be, even 1 minute later. So, and from there, our focus will just be ensuring that our messaging is coordinated, sharing information throughout any response. From the Aphis side, we really try to stay in our lane, which means that we're only talking about the things that are within our authority. So that's mostly the cases that are confirmed as well as the response. We touch on other things like food safety and human health in all of our announcements, because we want to make sure that those messages are getting out there and we understand how important they are. But then we really, really rely heavily on our industry partners to stress those messages even more and share that line of information even more. Also, some of our federal partners on the human health side, CDC especially. But, in that vein, we refer calls and questions. We work together on outreach efforts. We help set up media opportunities. And really the same with our state partners. So we want you all to be talking about anything that's specific to the work that's happening in your state. And I think as long as we build these relationships and have them now beforehand, that really will ensure that we're consistent in what we're saying and we can amplify those messages and ensure that people are hearing the same thing through a variety of sources. I won't go too into the weeds, but I'll just stress again the importance of coordination and unity of messaging now. We look forward to opportunities like this one to discuss communications to ensure that we're prepared for the real thing. I think with that, I will turn it back over to Liz Fernandez to wrap things up. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And on behalf of the National Training and Exercise Program, I'd like to thank all of our speakers today. I think it was a very informative webinar, and we appreciate your participation. Just a little note, if anybody has any ideas for webinars that the NTEP can explore for emergency preparedness, please feel free to contact us. And you can find all the webinars that we have been producing on the TEP video gallery, which is posted at Aphis USDA Animal Health Training and Development Video Gallery. And be sure to watch your email for upcoming webinars that are in the process of being scheduled. And with that, I wish you all to have a great rest of your day. And thanks again, presenters.